Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's Jewish Gen Talk with our program with Jordan Auslander. We're so excited that you're here today. We'll get started momentarily. In the meantime, let us know in the chat where you're logging in from. We're so excited you're here, and we'll get started momentarily. So you have Laura in Miami, Florida.
Yay, Miami.
Jay Nisholtz from Maryland. We have people from Jerusalem.
Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Bucks County.
Chicago, Denver,
Brooklyn,
Colorado.
Denver, Redondo Beach, Cleveland, Ellicott City. Oh, the Schneers. Hello.
Amman, Jordan. Welcome.
Yeah, they named that whole city after me, but my name's not Amman.
We have Phil Goldfarb from Tulsa. He's the
David
director
Boulder from London. No, I'm sorry, David London from Boulder, Colorado. Sorry, David.
Okay, well, welcome everyone. Welcome to everybody who's joining us for today's Jewish Gen Talk. We are so glad that you're here. We're going to get started. My name is Avram Grohl, and I am privileged to oversee Jewish Gen, which is the Jewish Genealogical Research Division of the Museum of Jewish Heritage in Lower Manhattan in New York City. If you've never been here, as always, the next time you're in New York, I invite you to come and let me know. I'd be glad to show you around. The talk today we have is with Jordan Auslander. He's going to speak on the topic of American Jews in the First World War. Very interesting topic, and I'm sure you'll find his presentation very informative. A couple of notes before we get started. Jordan will take questions at the end of the program. You can put your questions, please, in the Q&A on the bottom of the screen, and Jordan will try to get to them, as many as possible. Please do not put the questions in the chat. The chat will leave open so you can all communicate with each other and you could share information and you could comment as we go along, but we're not going to be looking in the chat for questions. The session is being recorded. We'll put it on our YouTube channel, hopefully later this afternoon, and we'll send out an email when that's live. Jordan has graciously created and provided us with a handout, which I'm going to post in the chat momentarily, and we'll also include a link to it in the follow-up email that goes out later today. So you're encouraged to take notes, but you can always catch the recording, and the handout will be included in the email. We'll also enable the live transcription, and will be a wonderful program. Just a little bit about Jordan, as he likes to describe himself. He's a great guy. Professionally, he's a former transportation planner, and now is a New York-based genealogical researcher, lecturer, and expert witness. He has pursued cases in the United States, Europe, and Israel. He has translated, created, and published an index to vital records in the Slovak State Archive. He's created a Genealogical Gazetteer of the Kingdom of Hungary, has many, many articles, including history and documentation of U.S. participants in World War I. So he is quite an expert in the field, and we are very privileged and pleased that he has joined us today. So without further ado, I pass it over to Jordan Auslander.
Well, thank you, Avrami. As you know, in academia, as well as Jewish genealogy, it's publish or perish. So I originally put this together for the centennial of the First World War in 2014, and have added a few things. It fascinated me because this was a specific time and a specific situation. We are at the beginning of the third wave, or sorry, the end of the third wave of immigration. There were a lot of second generation and first generation Jews in the United States. The Jewish population of the United States had swelled to almost to over 3.25%, probably the largest percentage of its time. And this was also an unprecedented time for America. It was the first massive draft registration since the Civil War, when the Jewish population of the United States was still quite minimal. First I'm going to start with some brief history of World War I. It's sort of an abstraction to most Americans because, who knows where and what, and everyone knows about the trench warfare, but I mean, essentially it was Archduke Ferdinand is assassinated, so Germany invades France. it was a fratricidal war. I mean, here you have at the British monarch's funeral, all these people, the Kaiser, the Czar, all these people would be at each other's throats in 4 years, which is ironic because they were colonels in each other's military, and many of them were second cousins to each other. So the war was unnecessary, stupid, wasteful, but it also accelerated the United States' preeminence as a world power, because the United States was neutral basically until we started the war, and we were aiding both sides had it not been for the British blockade, et cetera, et cetera. We'll get into that later. So this is pretty much how the war looked from a military map. That's a static line. The Germans were advancing until about September of 1914, just shy of Paris, and the trench warfare just ground on. The United States, as I said, was still neutral, and it's kind of interesting because with the combatants, Germany against Russia, a lot of Jews had, the Kishinev pogroms and other pogroms still fresh in their minds, were more sympathetic to the Germans. But everything got a little wonky after that. You can see the whole war changed the face of warfare, aircraft, gas warfare, and the like. It was really unprecedented, even the introduction of the tank. So the Allies wanted the United States in the war. It wasn't like World War I where we had Lend-Lease and all that. And you'll also notice, those of you who've been tracking immigration, that it stopped for the war years. It sort of ground to a halt in the mid-1920s because of the change of immigration laws in the United States. But submarine warfare, unrestricted submarine warfare, really just ended all civilian travel across the Atlantic. And here you can see on the left, notice from the German embassy, warning ships, and then the Lusitania, it's sailing on that notice. And that was sunk, oh, there we go, by a German submarine. What wasn't known at the time was it was actually carrying ammunition and war supplies from the United States to Britain. But it was great for propaganda. The United States, again, fiercely isolationist. Why should we, risk our sons for the, European monarchs and what have you? See that. There was some prior military experience. The United States military was about 125,000. The standing army wasn't really much of that. It was mostly the cadre, the officers and non-commissioned officers to be filled out as needed. But there were some actions, as you can see. The National Guard was mobilized for the punitive expedition against Pancho Villa in Mexico. The U.S. military was sent all over South and Central America during that time because of the Monroe Doctrine. But the war still touched America. As I said, we were aiding both sides, but essentially the Allies. And German saboteurs were successful in blowing up an ammunition shipment destined for the Allies in New Jersey, which is now close to what is now Liberty State Park. Essentially a 1 kiloton blast broke windows all over the area and registered on the Richter scale. The saboteurs actually were caught eventually, and Germany, I believe, paid reparations, finally ending in 1980. You see, just tremendous damage. Again, there was a lot of propaganda. You see that's the Kaiser stalking the Woolworth building, which was completed in 1913, tallest building in the world at the time. Some Americans in advance of the declaration of war saw service with the Allies, being recruited by the British and the Canadians. This was just sent to me by Brad Merkin. I thought I'd add that. This was an American Jew in the British Expeditionary Force. It's a little suspect as he's written his own tale and may have embellished it, but thank you, Brad, for that. As I said, the recruiting of Americans was active, but this is actually a poster where Canadian Jews are specifically being recruited. And there's, of course, the famous Lafayette Escadrille, Americans flying for France prior to the war, and that was their emblem. Interesting, the Native American symbol of the swastika appears in the headdress. That was before Hitler tilted it on its side and ruined it for everyone. The United States entered the war because of the Zimmermann telegram, a diplomatic overture by the Germans to the Mexicans to take back what they lost in the Mexican-American War, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Pretty much everything, Colorado, Utah, California, most of that was lost to the United States from Mexico. And this was just seen as ridiculous. And so America declared war April 6th, 1917. Curiously, this is the date that the movie 1917 takes place, but there's no mention of the US declaration of war in it. I found that interesting. Great movie. Catch it if you can. So the draft registration, unlike the Civil War, where you could buy your way out for $300, which is about, $15,000 today, pretty much everyone, the first registration was for all men ages 21 to 31. There was a second registration for men who turned 21 since June, for the duration of the war, since June of 1917. And then there was a third registration, because we didn't know how long the war was going to go, and increased the age from everyone from 18 to 45 had to register. And this is, of course, a great genealogical tool. These are the categories. There were, deferments for those who were married with children, et cetera, et cetera. Also exempted or ineligible were enemy aliens, and we'll have a little more on that later. Again, many American Jews had come from countries that we were at war at and had not yet naturalized. So this is the first, from the draft registration, the first naturalization. Kind of interesting. This is my grandfather. Gives his town of birth, which was unusual. He had not naturalized as a US citizen yet, but he was from Poland, which again, at that point was Russia, and then part of the Allies. I found out later that he was studying as an agricultural school because his dream was to be a Zionist, which he ultimately did. Okay, this is the breakdown. This is from Sidney M. Gumpertz, who won the Medal of Honor, Congressional Medal of Honor in World War I. He wrote a marvelous book on Jewish veterans and Jewish participation in all wars called Legion of Valor. And his World War I chapter gives this is as of 1921, of 157,000 those identified as Jews and where they came from in a state-by-state breakdown. And you can see the bulk came from New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Illinois. It's a pretty interesting indication of the distribution of Jews across the United States. Now, there were Jews on all sides of the conflict. Many German Jews who fought nobly in World War I for the Kaiser, but that service did not save them in World War II. As you can see here, these are the numbers of Jews in each military, not as a percentage, but roughly the total numbers and the numbers of those killed in action. So for the United States, 250,000 Jews, 3,500 killed in action. You can see Russia, higher numbers. The war was just brutal in terms of casualties. This is an example of some of the World War I propaganda. Enlist in the US Army, beat back this mad brute, buy Liberty bonds. You have to demonize your enemy. And fear, buy Liberty bonds so German U-boats and bombers don't level New York City. See, Statue of Liberty demolished. Shocking. So the United States Army was about 120,000 at the start of the war. Marines and Navy, about 60,000. And the National Guard, about 180,000. So the bulk of the US force, which ultimately numbered 5.5 million, of whom 2 million actually made it to France in time for the war. But that was not ready for almost a year. And I like to call this the glorious footnote, because America's basically saw action for the last 6 months of the war. This is the first group arriving in London, great fanfare. So those who did not enlist were called slackers, those who avoided the draft. And the Bureau of Investigation went after them, as well as enemy aliens, and their files are available online through Fold 3, and there's a link in the handout for that. For those just joining us, I put together a handout with a lot of the links and some of the data that I refer to, because I tend to go through things a little quickly, but we'll have plenty of time at the end for questions or anything I missed or skipped over. So this is an alleged slacker, another slacker, but these files are kind of interesting. Enemy aliens. And if you find an enemy alien file, those are great genealogically. They'll have a whole family tree of relatives here, relatives in the enemy country, etc. This one I liked. Samuel Rovics is related to me, and he's listed, his file says suspicious character being investigated. By the way, it was J. Edgar Hoover who was running the Bureau of Investigation from its inception in 1908 to 1922, shortly after it became the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I'm just looking at this and what they're saying. He is a Jew, about 23 or 24, New York City, born in Austro-Hungary. The things that are underlined, very, very fascinating here in terms of what they considered suspect. And again, in demonizing your enemy, everyone remembers, freedom fries. Well, this is where it started. Liberty cabbage instead of sauerkraut. Everything was branded Liberty, which had a German tinge to it. Hamburgers and hot dogs, Liberty sausage. It's just wacky. So the first time the US saw action in great numbers was in the spring and summer of 1918. The war ended in November of 1918, but the first significant action, whoops, ahead, there we are, sorry about that, with the Marines in Belleau Wood. Now, this is odd because usually the Marines were in the Pacific, known for Pacific warfare, but since they were the first combat-ready unit, they were sent to Europe, and they lost a lot of casualties in a charge across an open field against German machine guns in an area which is still sacred to the Marine state. In fact, I believe they have a major ship called the Belleau Wood. Okay, so moving right along. What happened in 1917, however, the Russian Revolution in February, where Kerensky had taken over from after the revolution that toppled the Czar. He kept Russia in the war, and the Germans deliberately brought Lenin to Germany because Lenin was going to take the Russians out of the war and free up all those millions of troops for the Western Front. Now, this happened at a time when America had declared war, so it was a real race for the Germans and the Allies to get those troops to face each other before one overwhelmed the other side. The whole strategy was these great pushes. You just throw a lot of men and hope they move these entrenched fortifications. Not a lot happened other than people dying in incredible numbers. The army was segregated. African Americans were drafted, and you'll note there was a little corner on the draft card to be taken off if the registrant was African American. Now you can see here this unit was assigned to French troops, and they were given French uniforms, French rifles, etc. The Americans, of course, under General Pershing, wanted autonomy over their own soldiers. So this was, showed what little regard they had for the African American troops. There was discrimination amongst, for all immigrants. They were testing immigrants for their knowledge. But again, the bias in the testing made those who didn't have English as their native language look stupid. And this, of course, was used to reinforce prejudice and stereotypes and the like. What a country. This is a later draft card, the third draft card, the third draft, and this is for David Sawulson, who distinguished himself incredibly during the wars as Sergeant William Sawulson. He's actually lied about his age. I'm sorry. No, this is his brother. His older brother, Sergeant William Sawulson of Newark, New Jersey. He got the Congressional Medal of Honor, even though he died in combat in October of 1918 while aiding wounded comrades. Jacob, reading all this, the citation. This is his youngest brother, David, who was called up. So September, and a month later, his older brother would be dead. The weaponry. Just a side note, the Browning automatic rifle, which was used by the Marines for the next 50 years, was developed for this war. About 50,000 of them were made. Most of these people went into charges with a bolt action rifle and were just mowed down mercilessly. This was supposed to be a game changer and a very effective weapon that the Americans brought into play, although a lot of them were using British artillery. In fact, to this day, that's why the US military quotes its artillery calibers in millimeters, because we're using the French 75s. This I just thought was so amusing. It's just two men admiring each other's gun. Read what you want. The recruiting for Jews specific in the United States. I mean, there were recruiting drives for all groups, even African Americans. And this was the appeals. But these are from the service organizations. You notice that the Jewish Welfare Board, late in the game, the week of the armistice, and they were still, everything was in full swing. The war ended kind of rapidly, but it was, even though it was a stalemate. And the Jewish Welfare Board was sort of a USO specific for Jews, and it was designed to take care of the Jewish soldiers, and it provided a lot of services, as we'll see further on. The Lost Battalion, a group that got cut off in October of 1918, and another American Jew got his Congressional Medal of Honor for action in this disaster. You can see it was just a very dramatic situation. The Lost Battalion, they were cut off for almost a week, suffered numerous casualties, but finally broke out. The Argonne Forest was where the most of the U.S. Offensive took place. As I said, it was really about 7 weeks from September to November of 1918. You see the Lost Battalion there. So Abraham Krotoshinsky, who got his Medal of Honor for service in the Lost Battalion, it's just the whole story of legend. But again, Jews were everywhere, great numbers. The percentages were a little higher. Jews were accused of cowardice and disloyalty and all sorts of things. But the percentage of Jews in the military was higher than the percentage of the Jews in the United States, and casualties accordingly. So there was the shirking, of course, was, anti-Semitic propaganda, which, of course, racism in the United States would take another 50 years before it was criminalized. Now, the war didn't end in November 1918. There was the second part of the First World War. Russia was in civil war, and the United States was no friend of the Bolsheviks, and the British were urging all sorts of intervention. And US troops actually served in Vladivostok and Archangel, supposedly to protect, Allied war munitions from keeping them from falling into the hands of the Bolshevik Soviets. But there were casualties in this conflict, and Russia was still a little miffed that US troops were sent onto their soil, because they remember the history that we've forgotten. Okay, so we have the American Jewish Committee, in order to counter, these claims of cowardice and whatever, started putting together a lot of files on the service of Jewish veterans, and these are available for research. And a great genealogical resource. A lot of them are indexed and online at Ancestry and other sources. Again, those are in your in the handout. The Fighting Jacobsons, they were another story. 100% American, and they sent, I believe, 5 sons to fight in the war. And it looks like all of them came back. And this is a little genealogical search I did on the Jacobsons. Is the Jew patriotic? You see, the questions remain. And this is an article from the Jewish Veteran. This is a publication, the Jewish War Veterans organization, which looks at the history and stories of American Jews in the military in the United States to the present day. So here are the Jacobsons before the war, living in the Bronx. Mom and dad were from Russia, Poland, but they were all born in the United States. This is, I believe, the American Jewish Committee. No, actually, I'm sorry. New York State, many other states were also pressed to document each of their native sons' service in the war. And a lot of these exist. There's a breakdown of that also in the notes. And these are a wonderful source for of genealogical information as well as military information. You can see the Army service number, where the person resided, when they served, decorations and the like. This one's for Samuel Jacobson. I'm not sure the field that was cut out there. Draft registration. Oh, here at the corner, that's to be cut out if the applicant is the draftee is African American. Military was segregated for another 30 years. Simon Jacobson, Gas Regiment, Benjamin, Harry. Now this is fun. This is the honorable discharge of Daniel Jacobson. You'll notice he's put down as Daniel Jackson. And there's a notation on top there. And all back safely home with mom. Saul's son, William and Samuel, referred to them earlier. About his Congressional Medal of Honor. We won't go over that again. Morris Greenberg, another interesting story. Do I have my notes on him? I mean, I could go on the individual, again, with about 150,000 American Jews seeing combat. There's a list of those in the Gumpert's book, Legion of Valor. 3 got the Congressional Medal of Honor, but many, many more got distinguished service medals, Bronze Stars, and the like for bravery. These forms, again, I think this is the New York State one. I should have cited that better. I think this was, I'm sorry, this is the Office of Jewish War Veterans. They were collecting the stories. And if there's one of these, it has an incredible amount of biographical information as well as the history of the soldiers' service. And you were also supposed to tell about other Jews that they should look up and who they served with. Sam Drebin. Oh my goodness. He was a career soldier, maniac. And he had served in the Philippines, all over the place. His story is worth a lecture in and of itself. But this is his naturalization. He was out of New Orleans, but died in Dallas, Texas. I'm sorry, formerly of Dallas, dies in Hollywood. Now, because Jewish mothers are very significant in the life of every Jewish boy, the Jewish Welfare Board made sure that everyone let their moms know that they were home safely with free postcards that were distributed to the soldiers. This was one that went out. Compliments the Jewish Welfare Board. Your son's returning home. Although I think the term send a salami to your boy in the army, that was World War II and Katz's delicatessen. Various states have searchable databases for their World War I vets. A lot of this was done in anticipation of the many memorials that were put up around the country. And speaking of memorials, an interesting fact, up until 1927, all military graves were marked with a cross. And this was, again, it became significant after World War I because there were so many Jews in the military. Again, the amount of Jews in the Civil War, while their service, they distinguished themselves, their numbers were effectively a rounding error. But the military catches up, and now again, marking military graves, there are whole commissions for this that maintains, many of these military graves are still overseas. A lot weren't repatriated for various reasons. And those are maintained under US funds and locally with fondness, especially in France. So you see William Sawelson has a military grave. And now, these are some of the available emblems to be put on your military grave. They've got them for atheists. They've got them for Mormons. They've got them for Wiccans even. Have their own symbol that can be put on their military graves. I think there's over 60 of them at this point. Yeah, there we are. Now, again, anti-Semitism, racism, which, as I said, wasn't criminalized until 1965, was still rife, and a lot of deserving soldiers were denied decorations or higher decorations because of their race or religion. And William Shemin, along with Henry Johnson, who's there on the right, were awarded their Congressional Medals of Honor in 2015, well after their service and well after their lives had ended, but their families gratefully accepted that. These things come up, and again, what is it? The arc of justice is long, but it gets there, something to that effect. And the American cemetery in France, one of the American cemeteries in France, and you can see that there is a star marking one of the Jewish graves. The same thing was for the British. A lot of people were Jewish soldiers were buried under crosses erroneously. So there's a lot of post-war recognition. Got some biographies of notable combatants. And what else do we have here? Descriptive photograph. Anyway, a lot of the details, as I said, are in the notes, but I think I'm going to open this up to questions because there is as I said, there's so much to cover. There were so many campaigns, and we've just focused on the Western Front and a little notation on the post-armistice action in Russia. But there were also Jews fighting in Italy. But as I said, the bulk of the American Expeditionary Force was on the Western Front. So I think that is it. And I will stop the screen share. And I will go to the Q&A and see what we've got here. Okay. Records for conscientious objectors. Well, they may have been prosecuted as slackers, but there were conscientious objectors, and I can't really answer that, but I said the best way to approach that is the Bureau of Investigation files, which are available at Fold 3. If you don't have a Fold 3 account, those are available to the public for free at most library terminals, the National Archives branch also. Did a lot of American Jews change their names due to anti-German sentiment? Yeah, there was a lot of anti-German sentiment. You know, this happens. World War II, Jews in Poland were accused of being pro-German by the Russians and pro-Russian by the Germans, you know, because of language issues and naming and the like. So it's life is unfair. But most, again, many changed their names with the naturalization process. And as anti-German sentiment was building up, specifically after the Lusitania in 1915, that's when you'll find the name changes. Again, these are people who've been in the United States already for 5 years at least, who because the gap between when your declaration of intent and your naturalization was a 5-year gap. Many people filed their declaration of intent soon after they just got off the boat. But as I said, you couldn't really naturalize until about 5 years later. Another exception to this is military naturalizations. And that happened at a lot of the military camps. For New York, Camp Upton out on Long Island. Another interesting thing is that the New York area was the major port of embarkation for most of the Allied Expeditionary Force, mostly out of the Bayonne military terminal. The Brooklyn Army terminal wasn't completed until after the war was over in 1919 by Cass Gilbert, and its design is credited with initiating the Bauhaus movement. Okay, how can I find a World War I, a relative who has been gassed in World War I? Huh. Well, again, there are several name search databases that are available. There's no one comprehensive one. You know, you could find his enlistment. There might be something in a state file which would give his military service number, which you can then follow up with in requesting a search of his military records. The military records are filed. A lot of them, there was a fire in the 1970s in Winnebago, Minnesota, I believe it is. The address is in the notes. All right, type answer. Oh, relatives who served with the British. Well, is this an American citizen? I'm not sure. The British are, again, the military documents their losses as well as their service. There's a ton of records, and because the British generally keep their records sealed for a century, World War I is now in the public domain for the British. So that would be a Public Records Office request. unless he was a U.S. citizen, then, naturalization, arrival records come into play. Where can I find records of, well, that's a general genealogy question. If you're searching for Jews from a specific location, I suggest you go to the JewishGen Unified Database and put in the location as a delimiting parameter. I'm looking forward to this talk, says Janet. Well, maybe not so much now. Photo says he was a medic. There are websites which will help you identify what the uniform your relative is wearing in a photograph means. What military. I have a friend who specializes in this. He's a photo retoucher, Sebastian Wintermuta. And one of his specialties is looking at a military photograph and telling you what military, what unit, what rating the individual had. But there are many people who do this because it is not a unique situation. Were only U.S. citizens required to register for the World War I draft? No. Again, my grandfather was not a U.S. citizen. Actually, he never naturalized as a U.S. citizen, yet he still had to register. So, and whether they were naturalized or not is indicated on the draft registration. But usually they only give country of origin. With my grandfather, I got lucky and he gave the town he was from. Again, these draft registrations are excellent sources of genealogical information. Do you have any information on the Jewish Legion, British Army Royal Fusiliers? Well, this is, in the lecture title, it is American Jews serving in World War I. That's a whole nother topic, and there is, again, a litany on the British Jews who served. Martin Sugarman would be an excellent resource on that. He's heading up an organization that makes sure that soldiers erroneously buried under a cross, if they were Jewish, are rectified as well. All right, the enemy alien forms, as I said, those are specific investigations. You can search, I think by name, for the Bureau of Investigation files, and that record group is indicated in your notes. But the Bureau of Investigation was the one that the proto-FBI went after the enemy aliens, and those files again are online at Fold 3. I think they might be available through the National Archives website if you don't have a Fold 3 subscription. Files were destroyed. Excuse me. No, the files were not destroyed. Some of the military records were lost in a fire in the 1970s, not the FBI files. Repost the handout link. That, Avrami, you will handle that, but I think that will be after this talk. The handout will be posted as long, again, I tend to be all over the map in my talk, so I make sure I have a very informative and organized handout. Is there documentation of American women serving in World War I? Yes. There were mostly volunteers. The military did not have what's known in World War II as the WACS, the Women's Army Corps, but many served as nurses. I'm not sure if they were military nurses or not, but if they were in the military, they would be documented as such, but their numbers were much smaller than in World War II and certainly today. Yes, children under 16 were deferred. Again, the draft was initially for 21 to 31-year-olds. And as things got more desperate, it was extended to from 18 to 45-year-olds. You could enlist in the Marines as a 17-year-old. And even to this day, the British Navy is a 16-year-old, but that I think still comes under the UN's definition of child soldier. It's a little dicey. But the Marines would take you at 17, the Army you had to be 18. Mind you, the voting age was still 21 at this point. And World War II Jewish soldiers were issued prayer books by the U.S. Army. Was this true in World War I? I'm not sure. They did have military chaplains. I didn't look into Jewish military chaplains. Again, because military burials were under a cross, and again, there was a lot of backlash towards the immigrants. I don't know. I can't answer that question about what the GIs were issued. I know that they were issued lots of cigarettes to get them hooked. But that was Big Tobacco's initiative. Okay, here's a good question. My uncle served in World War I. He enlisted in the National Guard. Now, the National Guard in times of war gets nationalized, as we've seen most recently in Afghanistan, and actually World War II, World War. It's rare, but the National Guard is a ready reserve for the military. And as I said, the standing army in 1917 was about 120,000, but there were 180,000 already in the National Guard. And this was a very important cadre because they had military training, and they were the ones who formed, the drill sergeants and the trainers for the 5.5 million who ultimately were put in uniform, and 2 million who actually served. Any access to medical records? Medical records are generally private, but there are reports of those who were treated for injuries. Again, not official records are available, but in some cases, because someone was gassed, I'm not sure if they got the Purple Heart for that. They should have, because that's definitely a war wound. But that might be under military decorations, or one of the private or the state inventories of veterans documenting their service. But I don't know of any name searchable index of soldiers who had been gassed or injured. Said, hi, Paul. It said that General Patton was anti-Semitic, so much so that medals of honor were awarded. No medals of honor were awarded in the Third Army to Jews. Well, again, this happened, throughout the military. All of polite society was anti-Semitic until Hitler took it to an extreme and pushed it underground. Now brought roaring back by a previous administration, which had trouble condemning Nazis. But again, everyone was proudly anti-Semitic right through World War II, until the atrocities. I mean, General Patton walked into the concentration camp and promptly vomited at what he saw. So whether he was denied, again, that's a World War II thing. Yes, there was discrimination, as we saw in one of the last slides, that Black GIs and actually they were called doughboys in World War I, and Jewish soldiers were denied, full recognition for their service. This, still happening. Recently, there was an Asian American soldier who was basically hazed until he committed suicide. The military is a very harsh place because compassion is seen as a weakness, and toughening people up goes awry. And what is